Good morning. Uh, this is Mr. Turner, and today we're going to be looking at a lesson on Enlightenment philosophers and ideas that shaped our country. Remember that as you're watching this, you should be completing and following along with your note guide, filling in key terms, answering questions. During a few portions of the slideshow, you'll be asked to pause the presentation and answer a few questions. And in that time, you can rewind to look for answers if you need to, or simply answer them off the top of your head. And make sure that you're pausing during that time and answering those questions, because I'm going to keep moving on in the slideshow, but I want you to stop and answer those questions. So Enlightenment philosophers, ideas that shaped our country. Some learning objectives. First, we will demonstrate the knowledge of political philosophers that shaped the development of the United States constitutional government. So we're going to look at some people and some ideas that led up to the documents that we consider part of our government: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. During class, we'll also be taking a look at some previous documents that incorporated some of these ideas that our founding fathers kind of used to pull into our government. And we will analyze natural rights philosophy of government expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to look at some of these documents in class. We're going to look specifically at the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and then relate it to these philosophers and the ideas that they had. So what was the Enlightenment? Different names for it. One name, people give it as the Age of Reason. It's discussed in terms of a scientific revolution, a renaissance or a rebirth of art and life. But what it really is that man began to use reason to explain the world going on around him. Not just accepting that things were the way they were, but accepting that they had a hand in what was going on around them, and that they could use reason, use thinking to answer questions and kind of have some control over what was happening. Before the Enlightenment, much of what happened to man, around man, was attributed to God and to religion. So the people would say, oh, well, we had a drought this year, God did that. Or there's an earthquake, God did that. After this, or during the Enlightenment, people began to use things like science and math and rational thinking to explain what was going on around them, and not just religion. This becomes a very kind of unsettling idea for certain people, because once you start to think about what's going on around you and ask questions and think you have some control in it, then you begin to upset the balance of the way things have been. Again, like I said, scientific revolution is just one of the names that people kind of talk about parts of the Enlightenment as, and that just is simply because people began to use science and use math to answer the questions that they had about what was going on around them. During this time, people began to reject the authority of the church, not necessarily reject religion, but reject that the church had as much power as it did. During this time period, again, much of what was going on around people was attributed to God or to religion, which gave the church a very large amount of power. So when they began to question that, it begins to question the authority the church has. It began to also reject the power of the absolute monarchy. For example, Louis XIV, you see a picture of here, was a monarch in France at the time. During this time, the monarch, the king, had absolute power. He was given that power, he claimed, by God, and it was passed down through his family name. So basically, the monarch thought that because he was given his power by God, that he could do whatever he wanted to do with no consequences. He didn't have to follow the same laws as everybody else did. Well, when people began to question the church and question the absolute monarchy, then they begin to question the authority of the monarchy. When that happens, that calls into question the amount of power he has. And that's something that the monarch didn't want to do. The monarchs didn't want to give up their power. They wanted to maintain control and be able to do whatever they wanted to do and make all decisions themselves. During this time, again, if you want to kind of sum up the Enlightenment real quickly, people began to think. They began to dare to think, and were less afraid of the authority of the church, less afraid of the monarch, and open about questioning those two entities. So why do we care? Why are we here in civics worried about the Enlightenment? These influential thinkers of the period would influence many of the revolutionary leaders and thinkers of the British colonies, which would be the future United States, which would become America. People like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and many of the other names that you might recognize as we're going through. This is just a couple of influential thinkers during the period here in America that would help shape our new young government. And also documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So the ideas of these philosophers would be directly translated into the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And we'll take time during class and we'll look at these documents, look at their ideas, and look at other documents that came before the Declaration of Independence and compare them and see how they are similar and what ideas translate from one to the other. So again, what I want you to do here is pause and think real quickly. Answer these two questions. They're on your note-taking guide. I'm going to continue to move forward in the presentation, but you should pause here, take just a couple minutes, answer these questions, and once you're done, restart the presentation and keep moving forward. So we're going to talk about a few philosophers in particular. This is not by any means a list or a complete list of influential Enlightenment philosophers, just a few of the ones that we're going to talk about here and study closer in class. So first we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes. He wrote something called Leviathan. In this he talked about man's natural state being selfish and vulnerable. What he meant by this was that each person would serve their own self-interest at the expense of others. So people with no government were selfish. They were worried about keeping themselves alive, keeping their family alive, and would do pretty much whatever it took to do that, even at the expense of their neighbors. So if I'm hungry, my livestock die, and I've got a large family, 20 people. My neighbors have a large livestock herd, but there's only 5 of them. Well, my family, having 20, can go over to my neighbor's farm, take their livestock, and come back and raise them as our own because we were stronger than they were and they couldn't stop us. Well, government is needed to impose peace and prevent this kind of chaos. So what the people would do was they would set up this power, this absolute authority, and use that as long as it could protect them in a just manner. So basically, we need government set up to protect us from each other. He talked about an idea called the social contract. Now, this is not something that he necessarily came up with by himself. A lot of these philosophers will talk about the social contract. It's an idea that they'll kind of share and pass back and forth. But again, it goes to people setting up government to protect them. So what it means is to have peace, to have protection, we must give up certain rights, the right to kill or steal from your neighbor in exchange from protection from government. Because even if you're stronger than your neighbor and you're able to take their livestock, eventually somebody's going to come along that's stronger than you are that can take your possessions. You don't want that to happen. So everybody as a group comes together and agrees to form a government for peace itself. He believed that without government, life would just be anarchy. People would do whatever they wanted to do. whenever they wanted to do it, as long as it was benefiting them. John Locke wrote something called Two Treatises on Government, and in this he talked about an idea very similar to what Hobbes was saying. Individuals lived in a natural state relying on their own strength. So kind of the strongest survive. So again, if you're stronger than your neighbor, you can go there and take what they have if you need it. But on the other hand, people can come and take things from you as well. This was an unsuccessful way of living because it allowed for so much chaos and so much killing and stealing and basically unhappiness. So to get out of this state, they left and accepted that social contract that we talked about on the slide previous, giving up certain rights in exchange for protection from government. This is an idea that we'll see directly related into documents that we'll look at. People are born with natural rights, or some people call them inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. And government was created to protect these things. So no matter who you are, king or peasant, you are born with those three things, the right to those three things: your life, your freedom, and the right to your property or to your possessions. The authority of government depends on the consent of those who are governed. So in this social contract we talked about, the people come together to create government. Therefore, they give government its power. If government begins to falter at any time or begins to fail the people, then we also have the authority to take away that power. So basically have the authority to make a new government. And this is something that the monarchs of the time period, an idea they didn't like, because the people felt the monarchs were not doing their job. So with this idea, it means that, well, now they can throw the monarch out and create a new government. He also talked about something else you'll see when we look at our documents, specifically believed in separation of power, a separation between different branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and judicial, each having its own jobs and its own powers. All right, again, I want you to pause here and think, answer these few questions. After you answer these, continue on. I'm going to keep moving forward. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he wrote something called the social contract. That doesn't mean that he came up with the idea, but he wrote a document, wrote a body of work called the social contract. And in this, he talked about some of the same ideas as before, but also some other things that we haven't talked about yet. Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains. So what he's saying there is man is born free, and that government has now placed him in chains. That the governments, these absolute monarchies that are in power across Europe, has placed man under, or put them under a lot of restrictions. Government is a contract, a social contract, between the people it serves and the government, and should have minimal control and be freely elected. Popular sovereignty, an idea that we'll talk about in great detail more in class. Government rests on the consent of the people. So again, in making this social contract, the people, those who are governed, have the right to set up government, give government its power, and also have the authority to take that power away. Talked about the idea of majority rule. The good of the community as a whole should be placed above individual interests. So the laws that benefit the most people at once are those that are best for the citizens as a whole. A majority rule is something that we're used to in voting in elections. The majority of the election, whoever has the majority of the vote wins the election. Rule of law, another big idea that we'll talk about in great detail in class. everyone must follow the law, even those who rule. This was an idea, again, that was very debated, very heated topic during the time, because what this meant was that if everyone had to follow the law, that now the kings and the queens had to follow the law, and they were subject to it. Before, kings and queens were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do because they were the monarch, they had all the power, their power came from God, and nobody could question them. Now, with this new idea, rule of law, if everybody has to follow the law and everyone is subject to it, then it calls into question that monarch's power. And that monarch did not want to give up any of his power or her power. Baron de Montesquieu wrote something called On the Spirit of Laws. In this, he talked about three types of government: monarchy, republic, and despotism. Monarchy we talked about, where you have one person who's in charge and makes all the decisions. Now, monarchy didn't always have to be a bad thing. Monarchies could make decisions that were good for their citizens. And then you have a republic, which is very similar to the idea of democracy, where the people have a say in government. The people vote. The people give government its power. And then you have despotism, which is where, again, you have one person making all the decisions, very similar to a monarchy, but those decisions are all made based on just what's best for that monarch, or just what's best for that person in power, not really thinking about at all what's best for his or her citizens. He thought the best government was that of a republic. Government elected by the people was the best form of government. This would be a democracy or a republic. He talked about something that was incorporated into our government: separation of powers. Separation of but equal power. Again, that's the separation of those three branches that we talked about: executive, judicial, legislative. He took it a step further and talks about a term known as checks and balances, which means not only does each one of these separate branches have its own powers, that it also has things it can do to limit the power of other branches so that no one branch becomes too powerful. Thomas Paine wrote something called, or actually wrote two things that we'll look at: The Rights of Man and Common Sense, and championed the idea that all men are created free and equal in their rights. Government is created to preserve these rights. We have certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So a lot of what he talks about, he's a much later Enlightenment thinker. So a lot of what he talks about are kind of things that have been talked about by other philosophers. And he's kind of using them in his own way. Again, government is based on the power that people give it, the consent of the governed, also called popular sovereignty. Again, I want you to pause here and think, why is it important that everyone, even those who govern, are subject to the law? Well, that's the end of the presentation. Again, make sure you have completed that note-taking guide before you come to class and done all your pause and think questions. Thanks. I look forward to seeing you in class and discussing these topics in further detail.